So I'm going to be reading from this book. It's called Black Slave Owners, Free Black Slave Masters in South Carolina, 1790, 1860 by Larry Koger. So I bought the Kindle version so I can have access to the whole book. And this is the book right here. This is the cover, Black Slave Owners again, Free Black Slave Masters in South Carolina by Larry Koger. It says here in the foreword, in South Carolina, free Negro masters were similar to white slave owners. Both exploited the labor of slaves with a desire for profits. Continuing the introduction of the book, it says here, black slaveholding is a historical phenomenon which has not been fully explored by scholars. Graduate students of history are often surprised to learn that some free black owned slaves. Even historians are frequently skeptical until they discover the number of black masters and the number of slaves owned by them. All right, so even historians are surprised to find out there was actually people of color who owned slaves. There's still people trolling me, giving me comments like I'm making it all up. Like people of color could have never been a slave owner or a plantation owner, an owner basically of indentured servants. To many readers, slavery was an institution exclusively utilized by white slave owners. The fact that free blacks owned slaves has been lost in the annals of history. It has been lost in the annals of history. The fact, all right, this ain't people's opinions, this ain't make believe, this is nobody adding a narrative. This is a fact that free blacks owned slaves, and it has been lost in the annals of history. Yet at one time or another, free black slave owners resided in every southern state which countenanced slavery, and even in northern states, all right, every southern state had what? In Louisiana, Maryland, South Carolina, and Virginia, free blacks owned more than 10,000 slaves, according to the federal census of 1830. And we saw that census, right? We got the book. Many of the black masters in the lower South were large planters who owned scores of slaves and planted large quantities of cotton, rice, and sugar cane. Again, black masters, so-called black masters. All right, and they had plantations, cotton, black masters, cotton plantations. In 1860, for example, Auguste Donato, a free-colored planter of St. Laundry Parish in Louisiana. All right, and I've done people's genealogy that their ancestors go back to the same place, and they also owned farms. And these were people of color as well. So again, we got this person, Auguste Donato, just like if you saw my video, Antoine Decour, the Decour family in Louisiana, free people of color who owned, a lot of slaves, and they lost it all. When the slaves got emancipated, they lost all their plantation. All right, so this guy, Agosti Donato, a free colored planter of St. Laundry Parish in Louisiana as well, owned 70 slaves who worked 500 acres of land and produced 100 bales of cotton. About 600 miles to the east of Louisiana, in the county of Sumter, South Carolina, William Ellison, a free colored planter, used the labor of 70 slaves to cultivate 100 bales of cotton in 1861. All right, another guy right there. So this is a future video. I'm going to do a personal video on William Ellison, who was the biggest slaver in this area. You'd be surprised. We're going to find out. In South Carolina, Robert Michael Collins and Margaret Mitchell Harris used their slaves to till the soil of Santee Plantation and grew 240 pounds of rice in 1849. Do the research. These are people of color. But the majority of the large colored planters lived in Louisiana and planted sugarcane. Most of them were where? In Louisiana. In 1860, Madame Cyprien Ricard and her son Pierre Ricard, free mulattoes of Iberville Parish, owned 168 slaves. All right, they owned what? 168 slaves. These people of color, free mulattoes. The joint operation of mother and son used the labor of slaves to produce 515 hogsheads of sugar in 1859. Yet not all of the black masters were planters or from the South. In fact, the city of New York had 8 black slave owners who owned 17 slaves in 1830. All right, even New York. In short, the institution of black slave owning was widespread, stretching as far north as New York and as far south as Florida, extending westward into Kentucky, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Missouri. One may ask, where did these free black masters come from? And we're in chapter 2 of this book. It says here the numbers and distribution of black slaveholding. On January 1st, 1863, President Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, if you're new to my channel, you haven't seen my video on President Abraham Lincoln. We all know that this person was a colored man, what you would call a so-called Negro. Abraham Lincoln, yes, he was a colored man. We've proven it. His own autobiography and all the primary sources from that time are describing him with dark skin, swarthy, his parents, and all that. His mom's a Melungeon. His father seems to be swarthy Germans. All right. So again, this is telling us that in this year is when Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, thus initiating the legal process to free the slaves in the rebellion southern states and eventually to eliminate chattel slavery in North America. The ramifications of Lincoln's proclamation affected not only thousands of white slave masters, but hundreds of black slaveholders, all right? It also affected black slaveholders. See, you thought it was just white people. They told us, when they told us history, they said, oh, they made us think that, Abraham Lincoln, a white guy, freed so-called Negroes from slavery, right? But it wasn't like that. Indentured servitude had both black, so-called black people and white people in indenture or so-called slaves. There was, yes, white servitude, right? You missed my white servitude videos. Make sure to catch those. All right, we got the primary sources. We got all the history of who really was going through a middle passage. We're talking about both pale skin and so-called black Europeans coming over as indentured service, convicts, prisoners of war, and even as colonists, with their head right system getting land grants right away with their own indentured servants. All right, so again, what Lincoln did that day, not only, basically ruined many white plantation owners, it also, ruined a lot of black plantation owners and slaveholders. Thousands, all right, hundreds. In Charleston City, In Charleston City, for example, there were 91 free black masters who owned 268 slaves when President Lincoln signed that historic document. Upon the conclusion of the Civil War, more than 75 black masters in that city were instructed to free their slaves, who numbered 241 bondsmen. I bet you a lot of those were so called white people or pale skinned people, not just so called black people. The number of black slave owners during the war years was a fraction of the total slaveholding community of Afro Americans, the hijack, people of color, over all the slavery years in South Carolina. In 1860, the number of black slave masters was reported to be 171 persons who held 766 slaves in the state. All right? In South Carolina, did you just hear that? 171 slave, so-called black slave owners, people of color that owned 766 so-called slaves. And this again, this includes aboriginals as indentured servants or so-called slaves. This includes so-called black and white Europeans as slaves too. Continuing in the book, Black Slave Owners, Free Black Slave Masters in South Carolina, 1790, 1860. It says here the prevalence of urban black slave owners can be attributed to the economic development of the free black caste in Charleston City. Clearly, the urban setting provided the colored entrepreneurs with the means to earn a livelihood and prosper. Many free blacks availed themselves of the economic benefits which could be extracted from Charleston City and worked as barbers, bricklayers, carpenters, mantua makers, millwrights, pastry cooks, seamstresses, shoemakers, tailors, and tinplate makers, thereby earning the capital to invest in slave property. From 1810 until 1825, William Pensel, all right, William Pensel, a free mulatto and a tinplate worker from Charleston City, used the proceeds from his trade to purchase slaves. In 1814, for example, Pensel bought an 8-year-old named Stephen from E.M. Logan for 180. Nearly 7 years later, he purchased a servant woman named Nancy for $537.50. William Pensel's acquisition of slaves did not cease with the purchase of 2 slaves, but continued into 1823. In that year, he bought Suki and her children, Thorn and Harriet, for $700. Within 9 years, the profits from his trade permitted him to purchase 4 slaves for a combined sum of $1,417.50. As the economy of Charleston City continued to expand, many free blacks were able to buy slaves, and the port city became the center of black slaveholding in South Carolina. Why did it become the main port for slaveholding? Because of these free people of color who were slave owners, slave masters. Indeed, so widespread was black slaveholding in the city of Charleston that the majority of free black heads of household owned slaves from 1820 to 1840. When the first federal census of 1790 was taken, it revealed that 36 out of 102, or 35.2%, of the free black heads of family held slaves in Charleston City. By 1800, nearly 1 out of every 3 colored heads of household were recorded with slave property. Between 1820 and 1840, the percentage of slaveholding heads of family ranged from 72.1 to 77.7%. In 1850, however, the percentage of black heads of household owning slaves was a modest 42.3%, just 42%. The existence of black slaveholding in Charleston City was so visible, all right, it was so visible that a northern visitor to that city commented that a number are free blacks and own slaves themselves. This may seem strange to many northern people, especially to that class who cannot understand nor appreciate the system of labor known as slave labor. As the free black community prospered, even marginal blacks acquired the means to purchase slaves. In 1854, Rebecca Swinton, a 44-year-old black woman with no reported occupation, somehow obtained the money to purchase a 50-year-old slave named Mary for $100. Elsewhere in Charleston City, Joseph Maxwell, a black fisherman, owned 2 female slaves whose ages were 38 and 6 years old. In 1850, the only property owned by the majority of the colored masters was human chattel. For the most part, free blacks of wealth, as well as those of marginal status, acquired slaves and thereby contributed to the high percentage of colored heads of family who owned slaves in Charleston City. So again, we're in the book Black Slave Owners, Free Black Slave Masters in South Carolina, 1790 to 1860. And we're in this part of the page in the bottom. We're going to talk about these people right now. All right. And right here in this book that we were already reading has some information on them. So I wanted to relate this to what we're going to show about them. And down here it says in 1848, it starts talking about how slave owning amongst people of color started declining. All right. And then it says in 1848, Louisa R. DaCosta, a free woman of color from Charleston City, sold 21 slaves to George Thompson for $6,635. By 1850, Miss DaCosta and her husband, William P. DaCosta, retained the services of 10 slaves. 10 years later, the couple held 8 slaves, and by 1862, they owned only 7 bondsmen. All right, bondsmen. All right. Right here it says Studies in History, Economics, and Public Law, edited by the Faculty of Political Science of Columbia University. All right, and it's titled Indian Slavery in Colonial Times Within the Present Limits of the United States by Alman Wheeler Lauber, PhD. All right, Columbia University, 1913. From the beginning of the colony, the settlers of Carolina were in trouble with the Indians. In September 1671, war was declared against the Kuso, a tribe on the southern frontier, who posed as allies of the Spaniards. All right, so this tribe was allied with the Spaniards, the Kuso, and who vexed the Carolina settlers with petty depredations. The Kuso were quickly defeated, and the prisoners sent to be sold out of the colony, unless ransomed by their countrymen. During the war with the Stono Indians in 1680, the captive Indians were brought to Charleston and sold by Governor West to the traders in the colony to be carried to the West Indies as slaves. Again, Indians, right? Being sent to the West Indies as slaves or servants. In the American South, European traders, mostly British colonists, operating out of Charlestown, South Carolina, engaged local and distant American Indian tribes to undertake slaving against their neighbors. You hear that, right? Who could be made to walk the ships that would carry them to Barbados, New York, Antigua, and other ports in the Atlantic world, where they would work as slaves, so to the West Indies, right? Once Europeans arrived as colonialists in North America, the nature of Indian slavery changed abruptly and dramatically. Indians found that British settlers, especially those in the southern colonies, eagerly purchased or captured Indians to use as forced labor in cultivating tobacco, rice, and indigo, all right? They didn't use Africans, they used Indians, all right? More and more Indians began selling war captives to whites rather than integrating them into their own societies as they used to do before the Europeans arrived. And as the demand for labor in the West Indies became insatiable, whites began to actively enslave Indians for export to the so-called Sugar Islands, all right? That includes Jamaica, right? The resulting Indian slave trade devastated the southeastern Indian populations and transformed Native American tribal relations throughout the region. The English at Charlestown, the Spanish in Florida, and the French in Louisiana sought trading partners and allies among the Indians, offering trading goods such as metal knives and axes, firearms and ammunition, intoxicants and beads, and clothes and hats in exchange for furs, deerskins, and Indian slaves captured from other tribes. Unscrupulous traders, frontier settlers, and government officials encouraged Indians to make war on other tribes to reap the profits from the slaves captured in such raids or to weaken the warring tribes. Nearly all the Appalachians were distributed as slaves among the Carolina settlers. All right? Now see who they're putting in these plantations, right? In Carolinas, all right? The enslavement of Indians indeed was carried on wholesale. In 1708, Colonel Barnwell of South Carolina made an expedition to the Appalachian province of Florida. It is thought that this was the time when Captain Naim of South Carolina, with a party of Yamasee Indians, advanced to the vicinity of Lake Okeechobee and brought back a number of captive Indians as slaves. A similar expedition of Colonel Palmer in 1727 against the Yamasee resulted in the destruction of many Indian towns, the slaughter of many natives, and the carrying off of great numbers to Charleston as slaves. All right, so we're at Charleston. We know Charleston was a big slave port, basically where a lot of the American Indians were sent out to other parts of the world. We're talking about including Europe and West Africa. All right. As the result of the three expeditions sent by South Carolina from 1702 to 1708 against the Yamasee, Appalachee, and Timucua of northern Florida, there was carried back to Charleston for sale as slaves almost the entire population of 7 towns in all, some 1,400 persons. All right, they'll tell you when you try to look for a lot of these tribes, which I learned about recently, the Timucua, right? These are tribes they never teach you about, right? But yeah, they're like, oh, what happened? They disappeared, or they exterminated. But you see what happened, really. All right, how many times did this happen that they got invaded, and then there's 1,400 now, and then another 1,400, here and there. Eventually, they blend in with other tribes, or they become, servants in plantations, and that's what really happened. Those are your ancestors, all right, so-called Negroes. The captives taken in 1715, when the Yamasee and Creek Indians made a foray upon the South Carolina frontier, were sold as slaves. All right, Mr. Johnston, a South Carolina missionary of the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in foreign parts, in his letter to the Society, December 19, 1715, states, "It is certain many of the Yamusees and Creek Indians were against the war all along, but our military men were so bent upon revenge and so desirous to enrich themselves by making all the Indians slaves that fall into your hands, that it is in vain to represent the cruelty and injustice of such a procedure. The English colonists weren't the only ones to use the labor of enslaved indigenous people, of course. The Spanish were almost totally dependent on Indian labor in most of their colonies. Again, the Spanish were doing it first. They depended on Indian labor, Indian slavery for their colonies. Writes Alan Galloway for History Now. Enslaving Native Americans became one of the primary ways to expand the economy for colonists in South Carolina and to lesser extent in North Carolina, Virginia, and Louisiana. From 1670 to 1720, more Indians were shipped out of Charleston, South Carolina, than Africans were imported as slaves. Again, if you didn't hear that, from 1670 to 1720, more Indians were shipped out of Charleston, South Carolina, than Africans were imported as slaves. No Africans. You see the reversal they did? They flipped the game on you. The two chief expeditions during the war were those of Colonel Barnwell, who was sent by South Carolina in January 1712, and of Colonel Moore in January and February of 1713. Colonel Barnwell expedition took 200 Indian women and children prisoners. The expedition of Colonel Moore virtually ended the war by capturing the fort in which the Tuscarora had taken refuge. 900 men, women, and children were killed or taken prisoners. And that's again what we really are. Prisoners of war, POWs, not descendants of slaves. In both expeditions, the Allied Indians secured as many as possible of the captured Indians whom they took along with them to sell as slaves in Charleston. and they still further increased their supply of slaves by attacking the peaceful Indians along the route of their return to South Carolina. During the course of the war, more than 700 Indians were sold into slavery. The South Carolinians used some of these slaves to work their own plantations, but because of the ability of captives to escape over familiar territory among familiar peoples, their captors preferred to export most of them elsewhere. Capital from selling Indian slaves was used to fund plantations and purchase so-called Africans, dodged the hijack. It was as if one could create capital out of thin air. The only effort lay in capturing the prey and transporting it to the market. Native peoples engaged in slaving for a variety of reasons. In exchange for captives, they received European trade goods. Many also hoped for forged closer relationships with the British. To refuse to become slave raiders, they risked becoming categorized as potential victims, with their enemies then filling the role of slavers. The Chickasaws, surrounded by enemies on all sides, used slaving as a way to strengthen themselves at their enemies' expense. But great losses in slaving wars weakened them immensely. The numbers are difficult to calculate, but I estimate that 30,000 to 50,000, perhaps more, American Indians were exported from Charlestown. Indian slavery is an important part of South Carolina's history that many know nothing about. No other state has as many historic documents that chronicles Native American slavery as South Carolina. For all you who reside in the state of South Carolina, go into the many historic documents that are chronicled there of Native American slavery. Do the research. As the historian Labor concludes, American Indian slaves were most numerous in South Carolina, and the number of Indians exported was larger than that from any other colony. Indian slavery intermingles with every aspect of the colonial record of South Carolina. Indian slavery began soon after settlers arrived and persisted through the colonial period. Knowing about the Indian enslavement is important, impressive, and persistent role in the history of South Carolina, and because it has affected the Native American citizens of the state. Indian slavery contributed to the development of the colony economically, agriculturally, politically, and legally. Indian slavery in colonial South Carolina made a large and indelible mark upon the tribal histories of the American Indians, not only of South Carolina, but of the southeastern United States. In short, the destiny of many of the American Indian tribes of the region was influenced and determined by Indian affairs, which centered in Charlestown.